land on which we are gathering today, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. To the Honourable Luke Donnellan, Mr. Bernie Finn, Nina Springmore and Samantha Dunn, from members of our Parliament House. To our guest speaker, Father Peter Huang, who will be hearing from today in relation to the religious oppression in Vietnam. To all of our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is obviously an honour for people like me, like us, who were refugees, who are now standing in our Parliament, the very institution that represents the freedom and the democracy that we Vietnamese always want, always long for, and we sincerely hope that with your support that one day the people of Vietnam will experience and will enjoy and be able to live in such a democratic country like Australia, like Victoria. You all know about the Formosa disaster that's happened in Vietnam, in the central of Vietnam since April last year. A year and a bit on, nothing has happened and has changed. There is no obvious remedial plan. People are still demonstrating, are still being caught, are still being detained, are still being physically abused by the local authorities and by the thugs themselves. Now, this information is not from us, the Vietnamese community. It is clearly demonstrated in the reports with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the likes of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. So they're all there and they're very all about it. Welcome Hong Lim and Mr. Bon Nguyen from the Vietnamese community in Australia. So today we are hoping to share with you what we've found, what we've seen, and we hope that you will take it to the next level with the Victorian Parliament, raise those issues with the Prime Minister, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and other members of Parliament to make sure that the Australian government has a clear plan of action to support the people of Vietnam, to make sure that we uphold our national and international responsibility as a nation. We will hear from the Honourable Luke Donnellan, from Bernie Finn, from Murray Thompson, and our guest speaker, Father Peter Huang, today on the issues in Vietnam. Now, I would like to start to invite the Honourable Luke Donnellan to welcome everybody and to say a few words. Please put our hands together for the Honourable Luke Donnellan.
Thank you, Chief. I'd also like to acknowledge the individual land on which we stand, the oldest living civilisation in the world, and what a privilege it is to have such a community in our midst. Obviously, I'd like to congratulate Viv and the team for putting together this presentation for us. I think, as we know, I visited, as we know, Formosa is a serious problem in Vietnam at the moment in relation to the company and the fact that it's killing the livelihood of so many people, whether they be fishermen, whether it be related to tourism and the like. And it must be very difficult for the community in places like Buổi, where I've got good friends and that's where they've come from, so I guess tolerate the idea that your government won't stand up for you. Your government won't actually ensure that the environment literally or really isn't being poisoned, the fact that your livelihood isn't being ruined, the fact that your future isn't being taken away from you. In many ways, that's very much the conundrum for the Vietnamese people, that their government at the moment is not doing the right thing by them, that their government is not standing up, whether it be even the fishermen in the Southeast China Sea and the battles which have gone on there. Again, there would be great frustration in the Vietnamese community in Vietnam in relation to that. And I think in many ways, many Australians love to visit Vietnam, and that's great, and they go there for a holiday, but I don't think they really understand the difficulty that the people who actually live there have to go through to actually, the fact that they can't disagree with their government, they can't protest, they get bashed, they just can't live with dignity more than anything else. So I think in many ways, look, this is important, Viv, that you and your team do this, to actually get the message across and continue to push the message across to all of us and actually say that life in Vietnam is not the beautiful place you're actually looking at, but is the lack of dignity which exists for the people who actually live here. So I'll just keep encouraging you to continue pushing this, pushing us politicians to do a little more, and actually ensuring that the general public of Australia actually understand that it's fine to visit for a holiday, but you must understand that whole lot more going on here now that is not what he'd expect and not what we would like to live or expect to live in this country. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone.
Before we introduce Mr. Bernie Finn, we'd like you to take a look at a short 6 minutes film clip on the situation in Vietnam as we capture it. So this is what happened in central Vietnam. 250 kilometers of coastline were covered with tons and tons of dead fish back in April last year. Of course, there were many people who wanted to raise the situation with the Vietnamese government, and there was pretty much no action from the Vietnamese government for about 3 months before they decided to undertake an investigation. This is Father Victim, one of the religious leaders who've been helping the victims of the disaster. The way they find out who the thugs are is when they ask the people to sit down, the thugs would stand, and that's when we know who the thugs were. And there were plenty of them in the crowd. The use of thugs is actually reported in the reports with the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. If anyone wants to read it, that's in the 2017 annual report. And this is the same thing they used throughout the Vietnam War as well. So for Vietnamese people, it is not new at all. This is Mother Mushroom Nam Quyền. She's 37. She was sentenced for 10 years jail in June this year for raising her voice. One of the saddest things about Mother Mushroom was when she was detained, they did not give her any use of the women's tampons and did not allow her to wear her underwear either. This is Miss Trần Thị Nga. She was sentenced on the 27th, I think, of July this year for 9 years imprisonment and 5 years under house arrest. She too has 2 young children.
Trần Thị Nga, 9 năm tù giam, 5 năm quản chế. Luật sư của bà Nga, ông Hà Huy Sơn cho biết, theo video trên Facebook của tin tức hàng ngày, bà Trần Thị Nga bị bắt ngày 21 tháng Giêng năm 2017 vì tội tuyên truyền chống nhà nước, vi phạm điều 88 Bộ luật hình sự. Bà Nga được biết đến qua các hoạt động tranh đấu vì dân chủ nhân quyền và.
She started out in Taiwan when she went to Taiwan and worked as a laborer and was abused, had her arm and leg broken. And that's why when she returned to Vietnam, she took more an active role in not just raising her voice, but also supporting other prisoners in prison as well. This is Mr. Nguyễn Văn Oai, who was, I understand, just sent yesterday for 5 years. He again was captured this year relating to the Formosa disaster. In the book, you will find that there are a number of prisoners that we've recorded, all related to this Formosa disaster. So this was the incident in central Vietnam, in Buổi, citadel, where a lot of the local authorities came and tried to destroy the big cross. Nguyễn Văn Đại is another well-known lawyer who's been detained for quite a while. He hasn't been tried yet. And there are many more who've been captured and detained associated with him. All of these names are known to the international community through the likes of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and various organizations as such. So these four men up there were just recently captured, and they were related to the cause of wisdom. It was a lawyer, Nguyễn Văn Đại. Mr. Nguyễn Văn, you might have remembered, he was killed in custody overnight for just being called by the local authority, and then overnight he was returned with his neck cut 3 times and stitched up. His sister in the United States is still campaigning for his innocence. These are the pictures that we've captured, we found, sent to us through Father Nguyễn Đình Thục and Đạo Hữu Nam in central Vietnam. It does pose a real threat to Australia if we are not careful about the way in which we deal with this issue. And it's not just human rights, it's also the environment, the sea level in Vietnam, and the Greens would know this really well. Adam Mann has done a research on this. He thinks in 20 years before the water level in Mekong is going to rise by quite a few centimetres. We think it's 5. Well, thank you for watching that short film clip. Can we please put our hands together for Mr. Bernie Finn? Bernie is a very strong supporter of the Vietnamese community, particularly on the human rights issues. And it's the most good-looking man today, I have to say.
Well, thank you, Viv, and to my parliamentary colleague, and to many distinguished guests, and Reverend Father, of course, and particularly those of you who are from the Vietnamese community in Richmond. Very important that we acknowledge the Richmond community just at the moment, and let's hope that in the next week and a bit we all get very excited about what's going to happen in Richmond. I made a speech this morning in the House, and I told my fellow MPs that I was coming here today at lunchtime, and I made the point that one of the great highlights, one of the great joys that I've had over the last 11 years of representing the Western Suburbs in Parliament has been getting to know the Australian Vietnamese community. And I went on to say that the Australian Vietnamese community is a hard-working community, is a conscientious community, is a community that never takes itself or Australia or anything else for granted, because they know what it's like, you know what it's like not to have freedom. And I see so often instances where perhaps those of us who were born in Australia do take it for granted. Those who have escaped from the tyranny of communism and value their freedom are more inclined, I think, not to take that for granted, and you're most certainly in that category. I went on to say that, well, I probably wasn't all that diplomatic in describing the communist government of Vietnam as barbaric in the way that they treat the Vietnamese people. I said that they treat their own people as dirt beneath their feet, and I said that I stand shoulder to shoulder with the Australian Vietnamese community standing for freedom for all Vietnamese people in Vietnam and everywhere else, obviously, for that matter. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to be with you today, to support you once again. And as Viv knows, she only has to ask, and I'm here almost always. And I urge you, whether you be a refugee or whether you be first or maybe even second generation Australian, that I urge you to keep fighting, because human rights are important. It's as simple as that. And it distresses me to see that there are people in Vietnam, as we saw there, who are being treated as you would not treat animals. They are being treated as I say, dirt beneath the government's feet. And we really have to change that. And I'm hopeful that if we all band together, we all scream loud enough, and that's important that we do that. We must scream loud enough. We will change that culture in Vietnam. And one would hope that very soon we will enjoy in Vietnam that same freedom that we have here in Australia as well. And that's certainly something that I want to see, and I urge you to keep fighting. Because that victory is well worth it when it comes. Thank you for being here today, and welcome to Parliament House.
Thank you, Bernie. We now are going to the keynote speech for today. We are very privileged to have Father Hoàng Kim Vi here today to speak with us about the conditions in Vietnam and to share with us his perspectives. Kính thưa tất cả quý vị, hôm nay chúng ta rất hân hạnh được linh mục Hoàng Kim Vi đến đây để chia sẻ với chúng ta quan điểm của Ngài về tình hình nhân quyền và thảm họa và tôn giáo tại Việt Nam. Xin chúng ta cho Ngài một tràng pháo tay thật lớn.
Thank you, Vic, for the introduction. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and owners of this land, upon which we gather and upon which this great house is built, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I'd like to in a special way acknowledge Luke Donovan and Bernie Finn, members of Parliament, to be here to listen to us. We really appreciate it, and wherever I've been to all these sort of gatherings that we see you there. So you're very close to our hearts and our fight for freedom and democracy for Vietnam, and we really need you. In the past, we have done lots of other things, and a couple of occasions I said we need to take this to a governmental level, both state and federal, in order for our voice to be heard. And also in a special way, Barrister Julian McMahon, who helped a great deal with lots of things in the Vietnamese community. The one that I can remember is Dan Nguyen's case. Thank you for your fight for him. It was very moving at that time. Mr. Bon Nguyen and other distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Hoang. I'm a citizen of this country and of this state of Victoria for over 31 years. A high school teacher for 14 years, 6 in Melbourne and 8 in Hobart. A religious minister for 20 years, and currently I'm the parish priest of St. Joseph's in Collingwood. The church is being rebuilt, and St. John's in Picton Hill. Thank you so much for this opportunity for me to brief you on human rights and religious oppression in Vietnam, which now takes place openly, more frequently, more brutal and vicious ways, both currently and in recent times. Though these things have always occurred, but in a more subtle and covered ways in the past. First of all, human rights. Vietnam's human rights record remains dire in all areas. The communist regime has maintained a tight and full grip on political power and allows no challenge to its leadership. Basic rights, including freedom of speech, opinion, press, association, religion, are restricted. Rights activists and bloggers face harassment, intimidation, physical assault, and imprisonment, even death in custody. And we have seen the most recent examples of the last 3 people as recent as a few days ago, one in June and one in July, which I quoted here, but we have seen it on TV, in particular, Mother Mushroom. The issue here in her case is that angers many is not what Mother Mushroom said, but Hanoi's stubborn refusal to repeal the draconian rights-abusing laws, the laws that, of the jungle that punish the peaceful dissent and tarnish their own name in the place of international community. However, a point I'd like to make here is that the ugly, manipulative and appalling things is that the Vietnamese communists do this and then use these prisoners of conscience to bargain for international business trades and arms deals. So that's the very ugly things that they do. Farmers continue to lose land to develop development projects without adequate compensation, and workers are not allowed to form independent unions. The police use torture and beatings to extract confessions. The criminal justice system lacks independence. State-run drug rehab centers exploit detainees as laborers, making goods for local markets and export. Nevertheless, increasing number of bloggers, activists, have called publicly for democracy and for greater freedoms for people. On June 20th this year, the Vietnamese National Assembly passed a revised penal code that will come into effect in January next year. Of particular concern is that an article passed targets people accused of vaguely defined national security crimes, including, I quote, activities aiming to overthrow the People's Administration, undermining national security, conducting propaganda against the State and Social Republic of Vietnam, disrupting security. So all these are vague, defined crimes. Instead of repealing such laws that are often used to punish the exercise of freedom of association, assembly, and speech, the government has now added even harsher punishment for bloggers and activists. Exercising critical views about the government should not be a crime. This terrible Vietnamese government should learn to tolerate different opinions, not just those that praise the ruling party. Now I'd like to speak about religious oppression. By nature, communism is anti-religion. The Vietnamese communist regime controls and restricts religious practice through legislation. One registration requirements on unofficial religious groups, harassment and surveillance. Religious groups are required to register with the ruling body and subjected to unnecessary question conditions and likely payment or bribery in order to gain approval. And I'd like to relate to my own experience. Twice as a religious visitor returned to my family for a visit. And during my first Mass there in the local church, during Mass, the Mass was disrupted by the police, and the parish priest had to leave the church to answer their question during Mass, and then he came back and told me, keep going and we'll deal with it after. After Mass, I was told, or at the end of Mass, this is 1997. At the end of Mass, my parish priest told me that please thank the local authorities first, and then get some money ready to bribe them after Mass. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to keep going. Invite them to your house for a meal and get money ready. So that's my experience. In 2008, the parish priest died. I returned for his funeral. And then afterwards, towards the end of my stay there, and also happened towards the end of the old year, and we get ready for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. And so the parishioners asked me to conduct Mass outdoors because it's a big one. And I said I might not be allowed with the government local authority. And they said, we'll apply for it. And they gave permission to me. This was about 10 days before. And 4 hours before it was due to celebrate, I was banned from it. And so I asked, what would I do in order to keep going? And I was told that you have to pay them in order to celebrate Mass. I refused to do it. And so I wasn't allowed to celebrate the Eucharist then. Well, the authorities allowed many government-affiliated churches and pagodas to hold worship services They ban religious activities and deem contrary to national interest, public order, national unity. Authorities frequently interfere with religious activities of so-called unapproved branches of Cao Đài Church and Hoa Hảo Buddhist Church, independent Protestant churches, Catholic house churches in the Central Highlands and elsewhere. And so they monitor, they oppress these smaller churches all the time. In January 2015, the United Nations Special Report identifies serious problems in Vietnam's approach to religion. Notably, I quote, legal provisions that tend to give broad leeway to regulate, limit, restrict, or forbid the exercise of freedom of religion or belief, unquote. In November 2015, the Ministry of Interior submitted a new draft called Law on Belief and Religion to the National Assembly. This new draft maintains mechanisms allowing authorities to persecute religious groups they dislike. For example, a clause in the article says, the abuse of freedom of religion and belief to sow division among the national great unity, harms state defense, national security, public order, and social morale. I'm pretty sure that in reality it proves otherwise. National great unity, national security, social morale are vague terms and have been arguably used by the authorities to punish hundreds of peaceful bloggers and activists. And we have seen Father Thuc and Father Nam on the screen before, and Father Lee as well, 22 years altogether in prison. And so it's a very, very bad situation over there and getting worse now. So as I just reiterate a little bit more on Father Thuc and Father Nam, last year after the environmental disaster that destroyed totally the marine life along kilometers of coastline as a result of toxic waste discharged by Formosa, a foreign-owned steel plant. You see the sign there before. People say, we love fish, not steel. The fishing industry is decimated, and many victims and environment advocacy groups peacefully protest against the company and call on the government to investigate and hold the company accountable for the cause of this catastrophe. Two Catholic priests, Father Đàm Nhu Nam and Father Nguyễn Đình Thục, helped organize these peaceful protests, were automatically branded as rebels against the government, creating civil unrest, bringing disunity and insecurity to the nation. They were then grounded and confined in a small location where they were strictly monitored and threatened to kill if they leave that location. The draft law requires religious groups to have been granted a registration for religious activities by authorities and have carried out stable religious activities for 10 years. That's a condition before it can apply to be recognized by the state. That's Article 18. And responding to this new law, the Vietnamese Catholic Bishop Conference says this new law is backwards in advancing the desire to have a good relationship between church and state. And it emphasized on a begging for permission regime and control, more control. So the government should show some trust in the church's willingness and even ability to participate more and more in social activities, in societies, such as education, health, charity, in building up the country. But until now, the church is not allowed to do it. Like the current regulations that curbs the freedom of religion and belief, the draft requires religious groups to register with governments for everything they do, including annual activities, festivals, conferences, conventions, appointments, etc. And stipulates that authoritative officers must respond within a certain amount of time but does not say what happens if the authority fails to respond. So these are the two main concerns, strong areas, clear areas that the Vietnamese communists are exerting power to oppress and allow no room to breathe for people and for other legitimately recognized rights as a human society. So please bear with me, just one more page, but it's necessary for me to make the statement. So I have Luke here and Bernie, Julian, and all other guests, if you listen, it will be great, and I'm sure you'll pass on our concern to the Parliament, both here and even if possible, at the federal level. So we respectfully ask the Australian and Victorian governments to heed our call and concern, both publicly and privately, by calling on the Vietnamese governments to, first, on matters of religious freedom, respect the fundamental right of religious organizations to freely conduct religious activities and govern themselves. No churches, denominations should be forced to operate strictly under government-sanctioned laws that are contrary to the international and universal laws on human rights. Secondly, to end harassment, arrests, prosecutions, imprisonment, and ill treatment of religious adherents, and release those who are currently being held for peaceful exercise of their human rights to freedom and freedom of religion, belief, expression, assembly, and association. Thirdly, to ensure that legislation dealing with religious activities is in harmony with international human rights law. Fourthly, permit observers from recognized international non-political organizations to gain unhindered and unaccompanied access to speak to individuals as well as groups and organizations on issues of religious affairs without any fear of retribution or retaliation whatsoever against anyone who speaks to or otherwise communicates with such outside observers. You know, I happened to watch ABC only a few days ago. Zoe Daniel, she actually went there and spoke. Did anyone see that one? Yeah, and she had to do everything undercover. I think enter into one of those prisoners of Bronson's family. She had to cover herself, all sorts of things, in order not to be identified. And on that, I would like very briefly the non-residential Apostolic Nuncio to Vietnam, Archbishop Leopoldo Girelli. Only recently, a couple of months ago, he was the main celebrant at a big outdoor mass in Hue in central Vietnam to celebrate Marian Congress. And he said this, for the first time, I think he has had enough of them. He said this, I called on the Vietnamese government to respect religious freedom in Vietnam, openly in front of thousands of people. And obviously there were some authorities there. And he said this, many people in the world would like to have a Vietnam as a country that gives more respect to religious freedom, and that respect to be upheld more completely. That the Catholic Church in Vietnam must be accepted as a source of benefits rather than a problem or an adversary in the community. So he said that openly. And he also said, give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. What belongs to God, give back to God. He quoted the scripture and subtly but cleverly asked the government to give back the lands of possession back to the church. So in the past he has been very gentle, but for the first time he said that. I think he's had enough with his government. And finally, on the matters of human rights, so we ask the Victorian and the federal governments to deal with or to communicate with the Vietnamese communist regime. You know, sometimes I refuse to use the word government for the communists, because they steal the authority from South Vietnam. They didn't deserve it. They stole it. They took it over. So sometimes I refuse to use the word government, because in Vietnamese language it means legitimately running the government. So ask our two levels of government to communicate with that authority to release all those in prison or detained for exercise their right to free expression, assembly, movement, or even political association, and cease arresting, detaining others for such actions. Secondly, amend and repeal provisions in the penal code and other laws that criminalize peaceful dissent on the basis of vaguely defined national security crimes. And finally, to revise industrial laws to recognize the right of workers to freely form associations which can negotiate with employers for a better and fairer wage. My conclusion, the Vietnamese government or regime can do a lot of good and better things by and for the people. I hope this message gets to them one day. Can do a lot of good by and for the people. But unfortunately, people are controlled strictly and oppressed by the ruling Communist Party, which exerts uncompromising power and total control in all areas of leadership in the country and even in the lives of people. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have heard and known about all these things I have said, today you hear a better truth. On the other hand, if you haven't, then today you have been informed. And please use this knowledge to deal with the Communist Vietnam with wisdom, with strength, and remember, I'd like to use the words of the former Vietnamese president in the South. He said, "Do not believe in what they say, but monitor and watch carefully what they do." Thank you for listening.
I always learn a few more things listening to you speak today. I hope you will have that speech translated in Vietnamese for us. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Murray Thompson. Many of us would have seen Murray around the so-called around the traps many times. Murray has been with us for many occasions in the Vietnamese community and has spoken in Parliament on Father Nguyễn Văn Lý and a number of other prisoners of conscience. We thank you, Murray, for coming along today, and please put our hands together for Mr. Murray Thompson.
It's a great honour to be here this afternoon in the Victorian Parliament, supporting the great work of the Vietnamese community in Australia, the Victorian chapter campaigning and supporting the ongoing campaign to strengthen human rights in Vietnam. It's some 12 years ago, the Herald Sun newspaper reported in Victoria that the work of a bipartisan committee in the Victorian Parliament had campaigned for and helped in the international call for the release of a political prisoner, Professor Nguyen, who had spent 17 years in jail. And what was his offence? He was campaigning for democracy. And at the Lunar Festival in 2005, he had been released from jail at the time. There'd be a sequel to that story as well. But it's been my very great honour to work formerly as a shadow spokesperson for multicultural affairs, working with the Vietnamese community in Victoria, the great leadership provided by the Vietnamese community in Victoria on an ongoing basis to advance the cause of human rights and to bring to light the circumstances of people who are being incarcerated for advancing democratic ideals. There's a great series of paintings that were undertaken in the 1940s describing the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and freedom from want. and I do have that series on a wall at home, as I admire the work of this great artist who understood the importance of liberty. On the question of freedom as well, there are the great words, and I congratulate Father on your great words today. In the Gettysburg Address, there are the great words of Abraham Lincoln of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But the preceding words for that particular speech are that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and advancing the cause of government of the people, by the people, for the people. So, Kevin and Viv, it's an honour to be here today to support the reasons that you are gathering here, to acknowledge representatives from the wider community, from many frontiers, my parliamentary colleagues. I'm Minister Dunellen, and I'm delighted to see my friend and colleague Bernie Finn has turned up in supporting colours as well today. His uniform just needs a bit of a tinge of red, but he's got the scarf for him from the chamber this afternoon. So we can show our support in many different ways, but I thank you for the chance to be here. Thank you to speak in the cause of freedom, noting the great work undertaken by the Vietnamese community. It's work at the Daniel RSL, being one of the traps that I had the privilege of working with the Vietnamese community. It's ongoing work at the Sunshine RSL and at a community base in Sunshine as well. I wish you continuing focus, continuing strength as you fight to advance the cause of Vietnamese people in Vietnam who have their rights denied. I can also see here Bon Nguyen, a great leader of the Vietnamese community in Australia, and Hong Lim as well, too, who's here supporting the activity here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. As you know, anyone who follows the activities with the Vietnamese community would see that there have been a plethora of activities that have been happening over the last 16 or so months since the Formosa disaster. We will invite Mr. Bon Nguyen, the President of the Vietnamese community, to help put it all together for us. But before we do that, I would like to thank the host of today, the Honourable Luc Donellen, Mr. Bernie Finn, Mr. Murray Thompson, our other members of Parliament, Ms. Colleen Hartland, sitting right at the back there, great Hung Trung, Colin Hartland, Nina Springle, Samantha Dunn, Hong Lim, and our councillors, Councillor Hang Tak, Councillor Lloyd Strong, and Councillor Daniel sitting at the back. And our very good friends, Barrister Julia McMahon and Murray Davis as well from the Baha'i religion, and our friend Jim Ling from the Epitaph Times of the Falun Gong community, and all of our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, including the staffers from the various offices of our members of Parliament, including Daniel and Caitlin from Murray Thompson's office, Miss Goldie Janter from Bill Short's office, and Kieran from Luc Donellen's office, and all of you here. Thank you for coming today. I now would like to invite Mr. Bon Nguyen to talk to us about how it all comes together as part of the Vietnamese community in Australia's national campaign. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I first acknowledge the traditional owner of the land and pay respect to both the eras past and present, to the Minister Luc Donellen, who's been supporting us immensely, also MP Murray Thompson as well, been supporting us as well, Hong Lim, as well as Colin Hartland, who have been supporting us as well, religious leaders, Father Hein, Youth Presidents, Vivian Min, and other organisation leaders and religious leaders among the audience here today. Forgive me for not preparing my note. I was actually contemplating, or rather more, I paid more attention to my severe redundancy at work, at where I'm actually working. So we were exploring that option. Instead of extracting alumina out of the ground, we were exploring an option how to extract gold out of the ground. So anyway, forgive me for that, but here we go. The Bernie Finn, with the Bernie Finn, it was a very diplomatic in terms of actually supporting the tiger. So I think I will go very straight to the point. Thank you, the Victorian chapter, for supporting Victorian chapter and the MPs and others. It's actually very clear, Julie McMahon as well, for supporting the national campaign, the Vietnamese community in Australia, in exposing. I'm not talking about helping the Australian government to with the human rights dialogues, but actually exposing the real situation of the human rights issue in Vietnam. After there was a video clip that you saw there, and I would like to make a few points in relation to that first. When you see a mass number of fish was actually belly up and actually washed up on the shore. Little that you know, there was 7 manufacturers was collecting those fish and refrigerating them. The Vietnamese people asked the government, why did you have to collect those fish for? They said they have to collect them so they can destroy them properly. That was their reason. But they didn't put, in a logical sense, why would you have to collect a mass number of fish like that so that you can, it costs you in terms of refrigerating them in order for you to destroy them properly. At any given time, in the capacity of these manufacturers, food manufacturers, was actually contains over 700,000 tons of fish, any given time. This, to me, has a very deep implication. That could be processed into food and could be exported to overseas, to Australia even. How do we have the capacity to even police that in Australia? That would have an immense impact on the health issue in Australia at the later future. Not only that, but when we requested for the water to be tested, there was the international expertise community tested that, but the report was never released. What happened was the Vietnamese, they asked the scientists who went back to Vietnam and smuggled the sample water. And this sample water ended up in the US lab. And they tested it. As you know, that when you smuggle things like that, it'll take days before it gets to the destination. Right? And then that's a natural cost that will be neutralized. Given that is the situation, when you get to America and it was tested and the result showed that's in some of the substance, such as phenol and others, was very dangerous to the people. It showed that it was 10 times higher than the normal level. In some cases, it was 100 times higher than the normal level. That may just give you a bit of a few more points added to this slide there. Ladies and gentlemen, after the disaster or a more severe human rights violation that actually emerged from the situation, what have we done? The Vietnamese community in Australia has been working in immense efforts with other communities overseas, and that's including the Vietnamese community in America, in Canada. And during that relationship, we actually we hope that we have actually formed a closer relationship with the US Foreign Department. We have done that, we have met that with them in the Washington DC this year. There have been an ongoing or collaboration between the Vietnamese community in the US, Canada and Australia. We know that at the end of this year, our Prime Minister of Australia will be attending the APEC Summit in Da Nang this year. We want our Prime Minister to actually at least have a voice or to pay attention to the human rights issue. The human rights issue is not just people actually physically abused, as we see, or mentally abused, as Father Quy has rightly pointed out. But it is the right to the air, the right to the water, the right to the land as well, ladies and gentlemen. We, the Vietnamese community in Australia, at the moment have a campaign to collect signatures of both the Senate and the lower house of Australia. We have a GIF. Over 10,000 for the Senate, 10,000 signatures for the Senate already, and we are close by to the 10,000 for the lower house as well, ladies and gentlemen. This will be tabled sometime next month. The request in there is to pay attention to the religious freedoms and also to the human rights issue, and the other one is also to reconsider our commitment aids to Vietnam. It is wrong, in my view. It is wrong, in my view, that we Australians are actually pouring over $82 million per year to engage in a human rights dialogue. It is correct to do that, it is wrong to do that, but the human rights record in Vietnam seems to suggest that it's getting worse and worse every year. Why is it that our hard-earned Australian taxpayer money has been pouring into something that is not resolved in something that we hope to resolve? So I think it's better for us to spend that money here. In my view, the Australian government have a very non-confrontational approach, and that is to have a dialogue with the Vietnamese government. We respect that. But in my view, that's just a way of rebuying our relationship. And should we be in a position to do that? I don't think so. I think that we should actually call on our Australian government, instead of giving money to aid in Vietnam, we stop that immediately, we suspend that, put the money in developing in the Vietnamese community in Australia until the human rights issue in Vietnam improve. Then you can pour money back into Vietnam. I was speaking on the train when I was trying to collect a petition just last week at the train station and on the train. I spoke to some of the Vietnamese who just newly arrived in Australia. And I said that the poor people of Vietnam are still suffering, while the rich, the Vietnamese official in region. This money, aids money, how do we know that it's not enough in these official pockets? I think that the Australian government do not have the monitoring system that actually in place at the moment. Subsequent to that, I have met with a number of federal MPs and expressing and exposing the situation, the real human rights situation to these MPs. I have put a request to meet with the Prime Minister. I have put the request to meet with the Foreign Minister, which I have met, not yet with the Prime Minister. The same, I have extended the request to the opposition leaders. And I know that there's a lot of ALP MP here as well, that you can help me to echo the voice. I have actually requested for that meeting with the opposition leader for a number of times now. And I haven't actually got a result from that yet. I'm hopeful that I can meet with him or the Foreign Minister, Shadow Ministers in the near future. But we know that from now to the end of the year, there will be an immense collaborative effort between the Vietnamese community in Australia and Vietnamese community in America and in Canada. Believe me, the Vietnamese in those countries are doing exactly the same thing that we're doing here, trying to expose the situation to their own government as well. And I also have some sort of communication back to the religious leaders in Vietnam as well. And I hope that with this collaborative efforts, we will expose the true situation, and hence the situation in Vietnam, the human rights situation in Vietnam will improve. Otherwise, this will continue to result in the situation of Vietnamese people fleeing from Vietnam, from the particular region that they are fleeing from. I know for a fact that over 200 of the Vietnamese people in the same region have fled to Thailand. But the Thailand government has actually worked in collaboration with the Vietnamese government. These people have no more home. Have no more home. While our ministers in Australia, there are Vietnamese refugees who are seeking refugees come from that region, who are seeking refugees in Australia. And I have known for a fact that at least quite a few families sending lying messages to me, seeking for help, have been sent back to Vietnam. Where are their futures? They are not. I think that it's time that our friends, MPs, that sit among us, our guests, important people, our veterans who used to be our close allies, our Vietnamese people that unite us. We put in we call a spade a spade. And
just wait 3 minutes. All right, it's not a fire alarm.
So maybe on that note there, I would like to stop right here, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that.
We can't hear the bells, right? So we are not having here. Cộng đồng của chúng ta có một số những đề nghị đến chính phủ, nhiều các đại biểu chính phủ tiểu bang và sẽ làm việc với đại biểu Cục Hoàng Kim để tổng kết những cái đề nghị của chúng ta lên chính phủ tiểu bang. We have a number of recommendations in this book, and we hope that you'll take it away and have a bit of a read. At the back, we'll provide a number of conscience associated with the disaster, and we will write a book posted on what we've done after today. Thank you. Nothing beats going to Parliament and having to deal